Hi, everybody. Welcome to Chapter 2, my favorite chapter of this entire book, because it's the chapter that I'm really enmeshed in. Sociological research. I think it's where the rubber meets the road for most sociologists that want to apply their work in the real world. You have to do research. You have to validate what you're saying. I can sit here and tell you all kinds of stuff in the way I look at the world. But unless I've actually studied it, I've looked at it, and I've given some evidence, all my opinions are just that, opinions. So as a researcher, I have to follow some pretty strict guidelines as to what type of research I do, how I conduct it, and whether or not it's recognized as solid research. So we use a basic scientific method to gather the data and test the theories that we all have about the world. It's real similar to the sciences and any of the other classes you've probably ever had that used the scientific method. In that, first, you got to come up with a hypothesis, and then you've got to, come up with some kind of experiment. You collect your data. You analyze that data, and then you give your results out, right? That's the way most of us learn the scientific method in grade school. And we do something very similar in sociology, except we can't really do experiments. I mean, I can't say, okay, everybody in this neighborhood, we're going to make sure that you're born into poverty and you live in poverty your entire life to prove that poverty is a bad thing in society, right? That would be so unethical. So we have to rely on data that we collect through various means. So when we come up with a hypothesis, it's really about whether we think something is happening in society. So for instance, a good example, and the example I'm going to use when I explain the project, is, cartoon violence and violence amongst adolescents and children. I could hypothesize that cartoon violence contributes to juvenile violence by showing negative imagery on TV, right? I could say that. Or I could be much more broader, and I could say something like, cartoon violence, or children watch a lot of TV and it impacts the way they're socialized, right? That's a huge idea. So I got to find theories and I got to find data that I can pull out and look at and examine to see if those statements are true or not. So I'm going to do that in two different ways, potentially. The first one is deductive. That's that, violence on television, or, socialization takes place through cartoons with children, right? That's deductive reasoning. It's very broad, and it breaks it down into very specific testable hypotheses. So in my research, normally I use a deductive approach, right? And I say, okay, for instance, I studied freshmen in learning communities at Cal State East Bay. And I went from learning communities to looking at how their identity was created and reinforced by learning communities. So I had to come up with 5 testable hypotheses. So one was there is, a bunch of different, or one was that familial ties, the family plays an important role in the resocialization of students coming in as freshmen. But I want to go back to the cartoon example. So if I said that, cartoons help to socialize children, that's my broad theory. And then if I break it down into the more specific testable hypotheses, I might say that violent imagery on TV in cartoons facilitates violent acts amongst children while viewing, right? So I would be looking for a violent act on TV and then a child responding. How does a child respond to that? That would be one way I could test that hypothesis. Or I could say, working class children spend more time in front of a television than um, upper class children. Therefore, working class children have a propensity to violence. I'm making this stuff up right now. There's no data to support that I know of. But that would be deductive reasoning, using the funnel approach. Inductive reasoning is when we turn that funnel upside down, so the small end is at the top, and we find a specific data or data set, right? And then we have to try to identify larger patterns. So we use inductive reasoning a lot of times when we do interviews with people. Deductive you would use in quantitative or numbers-driven research a lot of times. And inductive is when we are collecting data and then we try to fit it into the larger scheme of things. So I may be watching my niece and nephews, watching SpongeBob SquarePants and Dora the Explorer. Those are the two shows I decided to watch them, right? So as they're watching the shows, I'm watching them, and I'm watching the television show. And I'm writing down when one of the characters hits another character. Well, what did they do? Oh, Sophia hit Wyatt. Interesting, right? And then I might say, well, why did you hit this person after the show was over? To try to gather more data. And then I would take that and compare that with other children that I observed and see if there were any patterns. Do all children hit siblings when they see this on television? And if not, why? Right? So it's this, you're trying to come up with a law, or not a law, but a theory that fits the specific data. Qualitative research. I'm going to be totally honest with you. Up until I became a postgrad student, I really didn't like qualitative research. Because to me, you can't quantify it. I used to be a numbers-driven person. I was a quantitative researcher. In the qualitative research, you have to go out in the field. You really have to be able to get in and observe people, interview people, talk to people, do focus groups. There's a classic study by a researcher by the name of Snow, and he went native, and he and a colleague went in and studied the homeless population for 6 months in an urban community, and they lived among these people. They were participant observers. So they got to know all of the different codes, the cultural code of that group, right? They went through, you also can go through blog posts is another really great example of qualitative research. I know when we were talking about this new civil rights movement, right? A lot of you stated that the blogs had a lot of racially charged comments on them, and you came up with some theories for that. Well, that's what a qualitative researcher would do. They would go out and they would see, what themes emerged. Was there racist tones to some of the posts? Were there more conciliatory tones? What is it that people are talking about, and how did that shift over time? Normally, when you do qualitative research, you're dealing with small samples. So you're not going to go out and ask every adolescent or every child in a town, or in Oakland or Concord or New York City, what happens when they view these two TV shows, right? You're going to pick a very select group of students or children or whoever it is you're studying, and you're going to dial that in so they meet a set criteria. That's your sample, okay? So an ethnography is really just you're telling somebody's story. You're going in, you're observing things, you're talking to people, you're asking questions. And there's different approaches to that. And if you're going into the social sciences, you take specific classes to learn how to do just that. Quantitative research, which was always my favorite, is the numbers stuff. When you get those annoying phone calls and they want you to do a survey for them, or you get a survey in the mail, that's quantitative stuff. That's the stuff when we gather numbers, we gather opinions, we operationalize variables, right? And we can numerically, by using statistics, determine what happens by chance and what happens just, what's not by chance, what is actually a trend. Okay, and so we do this a lot of times with large-scale surveys. When you hear the political folks say, well, 15% of Americans feel this way, well, that's a large-scale survey usually. And it's usually quantitative research that they're doing because it's quick and it's fairly straightforward once you learn how to do it. The U.S. Census is actually a large-scale survey and is considered to be quantitative research. Now, if you get somebody knocking on your door and they say, well, you answered this question this way, why? That would be quantitative or qualitative research. They're usually presented to in most research to the general public as percentages. And we can find, through statistical methods, we can find different, like I said, patterns and trends. Now, I'm going to tell you, I have an advanced certificate in statistics. I never liked math. I was never good at it. I still can't balance my checkbook without online banking. But statistics is something very different. It's a way of thinking. It's logic. And once you get the bug, once you learn what you can do with these numbers and the power behind them, it's a really cool thing. So if you ever have a chance to take a statistics course, I recommend you take it, whether you're good at math or not. And if you have a good stats instructor, they're going to tell you this, that statistics is a way for people to prove their point, right? As a statistician, I don't want to call myself a statistician, but as a researcher, if I have the right numbers, or if I have a group of numbers and I know how to manipulate those numbers, I can make them say anything I want. So when you're looking at research, it's very, very important, especially when it's public opinions and things like that with policy. You always want to look at who's funding the research, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. Who is asking for these numbers? And then you ask yourself, why do they want to know this? Good researchers will give you those reasons, and they will try to negotiate or mitigate that to some degree. But everybody has got something. There's no non-bias in the world. I mean, we all like to think as researchers we're non-biased or unbiased, but that's not the case. We usually have some kind of stake in the numbers coming out one way or the other. So, very different than common wisdom. Common wisdom is the stuff you guys were doing before when you started the course, right? And those are the things that we believe to be truth, whether they're inaccurate or supported or unsupported by sociological research. And common wisdom is important, right? Because it can show us stereotypes, it can show us cultural capital, patterns amongst different individuals. But it's the things that most people in society hold as a belief that are repeated, and they're usually inaccurate, and they're not backed up by the numbers. For example, the numbers of illicit drug use amongst black and white individuals when we compare the groups. Most people say, oh, blacks have higher drug use rate. Well, no, not so much so. That's actually not the case. Another one is homelessness. When a lot of ethnographic work has been done among the homeless. And when we look at the population today, it's not that grungy old dude on the corner with a mustache and a beard that hasn't been shaved for 5 years. It's actually women and children. They suffer from homelessness by far greater numbers than most, and veterans. We know those are two of the biggest populations in the homeless community. And then, it can go on and on and on. I often say anything that you hear on the major news networks is usually kind of common wisdom, right? Because they're selling you a political or social position. And unless they have the numbers to back it up, it's common wisdom, right? So you really want to be careful that you don't fall into the trap of referring back to something that you heard without knowing where that information came from, because that just perpetuates stereotypes and myths, and that's not a good thing in sociology, obviously. So, when you talk about a scientific theory, they are all about answering a question in a way that allows us to repeat that theory. So, conflict theory. Well, we can find plenty of examples where people are, in the majority, the ruling class is trying to put down the working class or whatever, right? Well, we know that. We've seen that as a pattern of social behavior since Marx introduced it back in the 1880s. That's a theory. It's not a law. It's a theory. We never, ever prove anything in sociology. We provide evidence for a specific theory or a specific belief. Now, there's 4 things that a good theory has, and this is one of the reasons why if you look at the different theories that we've talked about in this class, you'll find that these 4 things are pretty true, right? The first is there's logical consistency. When you start out reading about it from point A and you get to point B, it makes sense. It's not confusing. Once you really sit down and you look through it, it makes sense from a logical standpoint. Falsifiability, that is when you try to prove it false and it just doesn't really happen that way. I think, let me see how your textbook defines it. Falsifiability is one of those things that it's much easier to teach in a methods class because you can actually look at the data and see what it is. But I want to see how your book describes it real quick. And that is, I'm looking on page 3 in the glossary, by the way, and it says the ability for a theory to be, the ability for a theory to be disproven, the logical possibility for a theory to be tested and proven false. So, in other words, my conflict theory example works really well when we're talking about an economic situation, but it may not work as well when we're talking about children on a playground, arguing over somebody, a little boy throwing like a girl. Well, that has nothing to do with conflict theory, right? And we can say, no, that's not the right theory to use in that circumstance. That's a good example of falsifiability, right? It's also got to have some validity to it. It's got to be something that is, and this goes along with reliability. It's got to be consistent. If I apply it, it's got to work in the same context over and over and over again. That's good theory. That's why the ones that we've talked about have lasted so long, right? You all gave some excellent examples of all these different theories as you saw them in your different posts and things. That's why these theories have maintained and stayed the test of time, is because they had these 4 different factors to them. So, let's talk a little bit about the elements of a theory. And I need to put you guys on hold really quick. I'm so sorry. I'll be right back, I promise. I promise. Okay, guys, sorry about that. Dogs had to go out. All right, so the elements of a theory. You've got, first thing you have is a concept. And those are the different words that we use, the terms that we use to talk about the phenomena that we're exploring. So, for instance, let's go back to Du Bois for a second. He was fundamental in developing critical race theory, right? But one of the concepts that came out of that was double consciousness, right? So when we talk about critical race theory, it's really important when we study it and we're doing research that we keep double consciousness in the picture, because it's fundamental to understanding the research done on race, right? It can be if you're using a conflict theory. Also, we want to discuss race. What is the concept of race? And how is it defined within the context of the individuals, the social group being studied. Okay, another concept, if we're using symbolic interactionism, might be the cultural capital that we talk about, non-material and material culture. So it's all of those. You guys know this stuff, man. You've learned this over the last 3 weeks, right? You're legit on this stuff. You know this, all right? And if you ever forget it, just look at the book, man. It's right there. But they're all the concepts that go with the theories that we've studied, okay? So then you have an operational definition, right? So as a researcher, if I want to study something, when I study identity, for instance, it's really important for me to operationalize what that means. So there's a bunch of different measures, right? Variables that I can use to measure the level of identity somebody has with a specific racial group or subculture or whatever it is I'm studying, right? But I have to be able to define that concept so that I can measure it and so I can observe it. So it's not enough to say I want to observe violence in children. It's not enough to say that. I have to define and make it very clear exactly what violence I'm looking at and how I intend to measure it. So if I want to see if watching SpongeBob SquarePants makes children violent during the viewing, then I'm going to count the number of times one child hits another, right? And then I'm going to watch Dora the Explorer and see if the same thing happens. And so that variable, I've operationalized the definition of the variable that is called hitting, right? So if I'm doing quantitative research, I might say, okay, Sophia hit Wyatt 4 times during SpongeBob SquarePants, within the 25 minutes that it was on. If I'm doing mixed methods, which is a very good way to do research, I would then say to her, Sophia, why did you hit Wyatt? Then I would take her answer and I would dissect it, find out the reasons behind it, right? And then I start to get a full picture of what this thing called violence is all about. I might even redefine my thesis or my hypothesis and say, I want to look at twins and how cartoon violence can impact the relationship between 2 siblings, right? If that's where I want to go. But we can also use qualitative type data in survey research and quantitative research. So if we are doing a study of the census, right? If I want to track someone's race, well, I'm not going to put one race above the other because that's not the way it works in the world, right? There is no hierarchy in that and in those classifications. They're non-numerical. They're words, right? So they're qualitative in nature. They have no hierarchical meaning. So race, sex, couple of other, there's lots of qualitative data that we can collect on people. The quantitative piece, though, is when we look at the actual number, somebody's age, the number of times someone hits someone, their income, even their attitudes about things. If they say to you, on a scale of 1 to 5, right, that's quantitative. They're operationalizing a variable about your attitude, right? This is really, I'm probably going to go way further into this than what you're going to want, and I'm sorry. I teach the methods course up at East Bay for the minor, and it's my favorite class to teach because, this is the key. If you wanted to learn anything about sociology, this is the chapter to learn it in, because it tells you exactly how sociologists think and how we, I hate to say twist the world, but we make meaning of the world in what we like to think is a very scientific way. So when we're dealing with quantitative numbers, right? Well, I guess you could do this with either. But when we are dealing with numbers specifically, we're looking for correlations. And that is what is the strength that two or more variables are associated with one another. Okay? So we're looking at how do they correlate? What is the relationship? Anytime you see correlation, you're looking at a relationship. If we're looking at quantitative data, we would say a good example of that would be, I don't know, with the number of the years of education one has is directly related to the amount of income they will earn with each level of education, right? So that's a causal relationship. In that, we're saying that education is the cause of that increase in income. As education level rises, so does income, right? But there's a spurious relationship when we are talking about a correlation between variables that's caused outside, right? So we may not find a causal relationship between education and income, right? Or we may say, yes, there's a relationship there, but in fact, it might be because everybody we're talking to is men. And if we talk to women, it might be a totally other factor, but we're not measuring for gender, so we're not factoring that in, right? So this isn't just cut and dry, you just do it. And you run the numbers and you see if there's something there. This process, if you're good at it, can take years just to figure out how you're going to put together that model. Because you want it to be as complete and take into account all the different variables. We don't live in a bivariate world. I can't say to you, based on your race, based on your gender, this is the outcome that you're going to have in life. I can't do that. There's too many other extenuating circumstances. There's too many other variables to consider. And that's why we say correlation doesn't mean causation. There's a lot of different reasons that two variables can be related to each other, but that doesn't mean they cause each other. Okay, and to say that is an oversimplification, and if you're studying a social problem, you're doing a great injustice to that problem by not looking deeper into the relationship. Okay, so when we have a positive correlation, that is when both variables rise together, right? So you start at 0, you go to 10, you see that slope upwards, right? And that means that there's a positive correlation. With an increase in X is an increase in Y. With an increase in poverty comes an increase in obesity. Okay? And then we have to do some statistical tests to determine what that is actually about. But anyhow, negative correlation is when one variable increases and the other decreases, right? So in your book, and in the slide, it says marriage rates decrease as male employment increases. Is that because nobody wants an unemployed man working with or living with their parents? Ladies, gentlemen, take a look. Think about it for a second. That makes a lot of sense, right? And I wonder what that number would be for female unemployment, if there'd even be a correlation there. That's an interesting one. I have to look into that. Do you see how that works? So one looks like a slope. Okay, let me see if I can put this up here real quick. One would do this. One would look like this, coming up and up and up, right? You have one variable here, and the line just goes straight up. The other one would be, the negative correlation would be an X. Okay? Or it might just look the opposite. You start from 0, you go to 10 or whatever it is, right? So one increases, the other decreases, and then the other one increases when it's a positive correlation. All right, so we talked about this, right? We talked about the falsifiability of good research and the validity. Knowing that you're actually measuring what it is you think that you're measuring. The bane of all existence of graduate students, right? Is when you go to your thesis committee, you say, I found the evidence. And I say, no, Susan, you didn't. You found nothing because you're not accurately measuring what you think you're measuring. And here's why. That's validity, right? That's what keeps people in graduate school so long, right? Is trying to figure out how to actually measure this stuff so that it's scientifically sound. Reliability. That means that if I read your research and you come up with findings, I can duplicate exactly what you did, use your methodology, and come up with just about the same results. I can replicate the results time and time again. That means that's good research, right? That means that you did it the right way. And then I followed your way and I did it the right way. This is, like I said before, you want to make sure there's no bias in that study, right? So if there's a study that comes out that says 95% of people disagree with gay marriage in California. Okay. Well, who paid for the study? Oh, the Traditional Values Coalition. Okay. Now I see. That's called bias. When one group is when the researcher is purposely trying to get at a specific conclusion, right? They have something at stake, which goes to the objectivity. Best research is done by people who really don't have a stake in the findings. I've done some research on the identity of. I've done some research on. Trying to think of a better example for you. Student outcomes in sociology courses. Well, there were sociology courses that I really didn't have a stake in. I mean, my funding didn't get pulled, and I wasn't going to get any more or any less than what I had before by doing the research for somebody else. That was heavily biased. So I came in and I was like, okay, here, I'll do it for you. And it had a lot more credibility. Even though they had a PhD and I don't, I was a more objective person to be looking at the situation and studying it. And it's value neutral, finally. So I've said this to you since day one, right? Ethnocentricity is the bane of sociologist existence. As long as the researcher's personal beliefs don't interfere with the outcomes, right? They have no stake. They don't make a value judgment. They don't say, hey, this finding is good for this group, or bad for this group. That's value neutral. They're just putting it out there, letting you read it, and you make that judgment, right? That's the best kind of research. It's not based on a researcher going fishing, right? Looking to prove something. That's bad research. When somebody goes into it looking to prove something in sociology, you know they have an agenda. And you know that that's probably not a well-designed study. Okay, so methods. Lots and lots of methods. This is just a couple that you would use because you have to systematically gather your data. You can't just go out there and pull it out of thin air. You've got to have a method section. When I wrote my thesis, it was 99 pages long, and probably 40 to 45 pages of that were just about my research methods. How did I gather the data? How did I analyze the data? What was the data I collected? How did I operationalize all that stuff? That's like, for a good sociologist, that's the most interesting part of the research usually, or the study and the article, is how did they get to this? What were they doing to get all this information? And you can do that in a number of ways. In your project, you are going to be using Fieldwork and participatory research, hopefully. But survey research, we talked about that. That's a census, people polling you to see what you think. Fieldwork is when you go out and, you observe. Like if I wanted to see, little kids in a daycare center, I might just go out there and just take a look, see what just observe them. And obviously I'd need permission to do that. Or I might go to a shopping mall and just watch people for a couple hours. That's interesting. Experimentation. Wow, no, no. We don't do that in social research. We do not do that in the social sciences. And the reason being is it's unethical. It really is. And there's no way that you can experiment socially on human beings without it being really, really bad. So I'm going to throw that one out. That's not cool. We oftentimes, as sociologists, we use other people's data because it's expensive and it's hard to collect the data. The easy part is in the analyzing of it. So, I showed you that example, the housing segregation in Palo Alto, right? That was using existing data that was out there provided by the government. And those databases, you can get it. If you want to study it, you can get it. There's lots of different ways, and you learn how to do that in methods courses. And then participatory research. That is, if I wanted to find out what the experience of cognitive development of students are online in a Sociology 1 class, I'd actually maybe participate as a student, right? And I'd study the way the class was taught, the instructor, the relationships between the students and the instructor, all these things. But I'd be a part of it, and chances are I probably wouldn't tell them I was. And there's some unethical things about that as well. But you're actually participating in the research. The example of Snow when he went out and lived with the homeless population. Participatory research. Survey research, we talked about this. That's a questionnaire. It can be interviews. If you're doing qualitative research, you can do it with interviews. But normally, survey research has closed-ended questions. In other words, there's not, hey, what do you think about X? It's, do you agree with this? Yes or no? At what level do you agree? 1 through 5. What's your age? Those are where the individual doesn't have a chance to talk about it at length. It's a yes or no question, or their responses are limited. Open-ended questions are the ones where you get a lot of rich information. I said before, I wasn't into qualitative research, but if you only gather the numbers, you don't get the voice of the people behind the numbers. And if you only get the voice, you have no numbers to substantiate that voice. So I like to put the two together, and that's actually a very common means of doing survey research. We'll start out with, like one of the studies I did, I started out with a class of students at East Bay. Gave them a questionnaire, said how many of you are willing to participate in a survey, got about 10 people, brought them in for focus groups, and all I asked was open-ended questions. Tell me about this. What do you think about this policy? How do you feel about this instructor doing this, right? They can take place, these types of survey research can take place anywhere. You can do it on the telephone, you can do it by email, you can do it in person. SurveyMonkey, online surveys are huge right now, but there's a lot of issues around validity. How do you know what the person that you're talking to is actually the person you're talking to? But a survey, the biggest example in the United States is the census, and just about every country in the world has some form of a census because it provides valuable data on the people that live in the country. Okay, sampling. You got a population. If I want to study all the students in the Sociology intercession course in winter, right, of 2014, that's the population. You are my population of individuals to study. Now, I can't ask every single one of you to come in for an interview. I can't necessarily, it might be cost prohibitive for me to ask you all to fill out a survey. And I want to know something very specific about just you guys as a class. So I'm going to pull out a sample. So if there's 50 people, I'm going to take 10% of you. That's 5 people, right? and I'm going to ask them the questions. And hopefully, if I have random sampled, meaning that each and every one of you had an equal chance to be selected, right, for the study, then I've got good reliability on my survey or my sample. Normally, the larger the sample size, the better. There are times when that's not true, but we won't talk about that. But, you know, do you really want 10% of 100 people telling you their opinion on something as important as violence in America today? Do you think that's going to be representative? Or if we surveyed 10,000 people out of everybody in the country, that's a much larger representation, number one. And if we're crunching numbers, if we're doing statistical analysis, it gives us much more, the chances that their answers came up just by random are greatly reduced. So the larger the sample size, the less of a chance that you're going to get a finding that's just random, right? It's just like, oh, wow, you know, that just happened. I mean, there's too much chance in smaller sample sizes when you're doing quantitative research. So we talked a little bit about field work. It's interesting, especially when you're doing it across a period of time. You go back every 3 months and talk to people and things like that. It's called a longitudinal study, when you go back and you have to see, you know, you ask questions every so often. People have done that for years, you know, 10 years. They've done longitudinal studies of students. And it's really, these are just used to really get in depth. People that do this type of field work or do this type of research are usually qualitative researchers. They want to get at the patterns. They're taking that deductive approach, right? They're going to take all of that data back, all of those transcripts back, and they're going to come over on them. There's methods that you use to figure out different themes that come out of that dialogue that you have with people. Experimentations, man, I'm sorry. Experimentation is just comes from the sciences too much. And what they're really talking about here is how we test our data statistically. And we can do this in a certain degree by looking at independent and dependent variables. Okay, what we do is we take out the experimental group, and we only have the independent and dependent variables. We might have a control group, but that's usually not the case. All right, and we use this when we look at independent variables. We're looking at a variable that changes, okay, or in the case of sciences, they change intentionally, right? That's the one thing they switch. Do you take the drug or do you take the placebo? And the dependent variable will be what results happen if you take the placebo versus the real drug, right? In the science terms, that's independent and dependency, okay? In the social sciences and sociology, right, an independent variable might be something like gender, okay? And the dependent variable could be income, education, things that are measurable, right? And then I'm going to see if the dependent variable changes, if gender changes, right? If men have lower education rates, higher education graduation rates than women, well, the independent variable is the graduation rate, right? The independent variable is the gender, right? The dependent variable is the graduation rate. That's how it works. Independent, gender, dependent is graduation rate, okay? And this is a method that's used to measure the differences between the groups. Okay, so we talked a lot already about this, working with existing data, and a lot of this comes, content analysis comes out of the field of communications. Um, the work on analysis of conversation really helped develop a lot of content analysis work that's done in sociology. And these are just some of the ways that you do that. And you can work with both quantitative and qualitative material this way. Participatory research, that's what I talked about before, right? And not only are you getting involved, but participatory research usually supports some kind of initiative or group that wants to improve things, right? And it can't do it on its own. So we did at the school at East Bay, we did some research this time last winter, and it looked at housing and beliefs amongst and housing amongst different groups among the registered voters of California. And we did that because we were able, as a university, to provide the service at minimal cost to the organization we were performing, and we did it statewide. You know, we were calling people down south, up north, all over California. And it was about getting in there and trying to help this group find out or figure out the best means of helping more people find affordable housing, really. And what we did as the researchers is we were able to go in there, we developed a survey, we taught them the basics of research, we developed a survey for them, and then we taught them how to use our software. And we worked with them collecting the data along with students. And that really led to them understanding why the numbers looked the way they did, and the results came out the way they did, because they had conversations with the people they were interviewing as well. So participatory research is really important, and I think if there's, I think this is where we all need to go at some point as sociologists, is to get involved in our communities and research these different problems and empower people with what we find. Remember, I told you before, I don't like sociology because we tend to talk to each other and not enough to other people. You can change that. Demand that you find a social problem and find a sociologist, i.e. me, that will help you support that research. You never know, you might get accepted to graduate school on a full ride if you can pull that one off. Okay, so normally when we do our research, we have to conduct a literature review after we have formulated our question. You know, we want to read about everything else everybody's ever done. I might be able to find a study that somebody's done that looks at exactly the same thing, so I'm going to duplicate it to see if my population that I'm studying matches this population. Got to make sure we have the best method, and like I said before, that takes a long time. The lit review and the methodology really takes a long time. And you have to take into account, how much experience you have, what's your goal? Is this for school or is this for pay? Are you getting a grant? Is this out of pocket? But the whole idea is that you go into it with a solid plan. That doesn't mean you always, meet the goals or the timeline, but you try, right? For me, the most important step in sociological research is the ethical implications. We have a moral and legal obligation to make sure that no one is harmed by our research. They are provided full anonymity, meaning that they, we don't use their names, we don't use their real names. That's why you see pseudonyms in a lot of research. That we assure their confidentiality. When we did the registered voters survey, there were 3 people that knew where that data was located and how to get to it, and only the 3 of us could do it. And it was very strict, and it had to be maintained. If we had lost or had something happen and people could tie those results back to the individuals that gave them, that would be all bad, and you never want to put one of your subjects or the people that you're studying in that position. Also, you have to get written consent, whether they're a minor or an adult. You have to make sure they totally understand what they're getting themselves into, and they have to be allowed to step away from it when they want to. Anytime that you're a part of survey research, if you don't want to continue it, you say, I want to stop. And they can't say to you, oh, come on, we only have 5 more questions. You say stop, it means stop, right? There's no safe word involved. You quit. And if you don't, that goes against the ethical obligation of the researcher. And you can get in a lot of trouble for that. You can get in a whole lot of trouble for that. So good researchers know that and keep that in mind. Then you collect the data, you analyze it according to whatever method you use, and then you publish the results in an academic journal, book, newspaper, documentary, or share at a conference. And you always have your professor on that paper, usually, which kind of sucks because you end up doing all the work and their name goes onto it. But, then you get into the groove of things, you've done enough research, and they say, oh, you can be the first name this time, I'll be the second name. But that's how you make your name in academia. It's not a guarantee. And when you publish in an academic journal, they're going to check all this other stuff to make sure that you did it correctly. Okay, so there you go, my friends. That is, I think that is all for the theory. Yeah, okay, cool. What I want to do now is I want to show you really quickly your project, now that we have that out of the way. So, what did I do? Wait a second. Okay, so, got this one. Oh, here it is. Okay, so this is posted at the bottom of next week's, or this week's stuff. And this is that individual project. You have a week to do it, and when you find out what it entails, you should be able to knock this out in a day, all right? There's 25 points possible. I'm going to give you the way to get these 25 points. It's going to be so easy. You're going to go, God, I love Ingram. I wish you taught every class. Okay, so first one, you're going to select a topic based on the stuff that we've talked about in class, okay? And you're going to write up an introduction, and it's going to start out with your topic, whatever that one. If you want to do Michael Brown, whatever it is, okay, I don't care, as long as it's something that we've discussed in class, in the discussion boards and in the lectures. I'm going to use that child socialization and cartoon violence that I talked about in the lecture, all right? I'm going to tell you why I have to give you the rationale behind it. So you're going to tell me why you chose your topic. I chose my topic because I have nieces and nephews that watch a lot of TV, and I want to make sure they're not beating the crap out of each other, okay? The third part of this is, why is this important for me to look at? You do not have to do a full lit review. This can be your opinion, okay? I don't want you doing a crazy lit review, giving me statistics and things like that. This is just your stuff, all right? And you can definitely look back on the discussion boards if you've noticed a theme in the discussion boards and say, this is something we talked a lot about in class, and I want to find out more about it, okay? And then, what do you hope to learn about it in the popular culture, all right? What can you learn about your topic by viewing popular culture, okay? And then give me your hypothesis. So mine, for example, is children learn violence from cartoons. Very simplistic. So the part one, I'm going to write an introduction to that. It's going to include all 5 of those components. I'm good to go. The second part, you can do this whenever you want. You can even do this watching Sesame Street and whatever with your kids. I don't care. Just find something, all right? You're going to select a popular television show from any selected media outlet. So Hulu, Netflix, whatever it is. I don't care. Try not to go with the news, all right? I'd rather see you do something that is in the popular culture that is not news-related, if that's possible. Your show needs to be at least an hour long. If you're watching a sitcom that's only 30 minutes long, you could watch two of them. So I know WGN plays Parks and Rec and then plays Raising Hope back to back. So I would watch Raising Hope and Parks and Rec, and that would be fine. But in my example, I'm going to watch SpongeBob SquarePants and Dora the Explorer. So I got that. I sit my niece and nephew down. I'm gonna write a little thing up. Okay, there's Sophia and Wyatt and Jason are in the room. 7, 2, and 2. Male, female, male. Right? Just a little bit of notes of who's in there with you. If there's anyone there, you can also do this by yourself. So while you're watching SpongeBob and Dora, you want to take notes on what you're observing during the show as it relates to your topic. So you might say, SpongeBob, man, he gets hit a lot. The big thing in the show is he gets hit 5 times, they call him stupid. 10 times Mr. Crab does this to him. 8 times, kind of quantitative stuff. And then when you're watching Dora, she likes to share, and she's very polite with strangers, and she's friendly to sad puppies or whatever, I don't know. Here's the hard part. When you're doing this, you also have to be watching the other people, if there's anyone else in the room with you, and taking note on what they find is interesting, funny, or etc. So you can even ask them if you want, but you have to wait until after the show is over, okay? So I would write down in my notes, when SpongeBob hit Mr. Crab, the children laughed, right? My niece gave my nephew a cookie. My niece hit my sister when SpongeBob hit Mr. Krabs with a hot dog. Okay, sounds good. I'm just observing what's going on. And if I'm doing this in a way that is going to be easier for me when I go back and look at it, I might put on one side, number 1, the observations in the show on one side of the paper, and on the other side of the paper, I might put the reaction of the people watching with me. So that I'm keeping the two things separate. It might be a little easier to do that. So then, after you're done watching it, you want to think of some questions. You need to have at least 2 that you would or will ask the other people watching after the show ends. They need to be relevant for your topic. So saying, how'd you like that? Nah, try to dial it in a little bit more. So I might say to Sophia, why'd you give Jay a cookie? And she might say to me, because it's nice to share. And then I would say to her, well, why is it nice to share? And she might say, because Dora said do, or, I saw Dora do it, right? So there's an indication that she's picking something up from the show that's positive, right? And then I might ask her, why did you hit your mommy? And she might say, because it was funny. Well, that has nothing to do with the show, but in my notes I see that Sophia hit her mom when SpongeBob hit Mr. Krabs. So there might be a relationship there, okay? And I'm making this up. This never really happened in real life, except during a hockey game once. Okay, so you're going to write up those findings in 3 sections. You're going to tell me what your observations on the show or shows were, what your observations of others were, and then the questions that you would ask. Or you did ask, and what the answers were. So this is just a bunch of lists, okay? You don't really need to tell me what the show is about. I really don't care. But what I do want to know is like the general theme, right? Mr. Crab and SpongeBob SquarePants were in a fight, and this is what led to it, and all this other stuff. Give me some context, but not too much, okay? So that's your second part. The third part, this is an easy part, and that is you're going to pick one of those series that you learned about, or 2 if you want, maybe give you a little extra credit for that, and then I want you to apply it to the show and what you observed, okay, as it relates to your hypothesis. So I'm going to look at the violence, and I'm going to take that back to, I saw a little bit of that with my niece. I would have thought it would have been the boys, but actually it was my niece that hit someone during the show, not the boys, right? And if it doesn't explain, if your theory doesn't explain your hypothesis, say why. Tell me what the contradiction is. People think that if you don't have something to say, or if you didn't find something in your research, then you've said nothing, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Lots of good research that people use today had no significant findings. But it tells us a lot if we look at it and we say, oh, maybe this is why they didn't find it. So there's always that potential. So tell me why it doesn't fit if it doesn't. So, then say, tell me if asking different questions might have helped you come to a better conclusion. Maybe you just had to watch some more shows. Or if you watched it alone, maybe if you watched it with a group, would that have helped? And what would you do to find out more? So this is real similar to what a conclusion section would look like in an academic paper. And part 2 is more your methodology. Okay, so I'm trying to have you do a research project that's easy, quick, down and dirty, and kind of fun to do. And I really recommend you do this in a group because it can be fun, especially with adults. But try to stay away from the news and try, you might want to do sporting events. That might be okay, but that's much longer than an hour. So, and then finally, part 4 is your reflection. This is your personal conclusion. And I want you, you can't find this in Google. You're not going to get this off of Wikipedia. This is your experience of doing sociological research. Was it interesting to you? Did you enjoy it? Would you do it again? How do you see the world now as opposed to how you did when you started the course, right? And most importantly, how can sociological research help you in your own selected major? Because you're not all sociology majors, most of you aren't. But how can this type of research, knowing that it exists now, how can that help you as a business major or a health science major, a nurse? Give me some stuff. Now, don't ask me how many pages this needs to be. All right, at minimum, it needs to be 4 pages long. Okay, double space, 12-point font. All right. But please, I will read every word you write. I don't want you to feel constrained or have to write too much. I'm leaving that part open to you. But if you turn in a 2-page paper, chances are you're not going to get all the points. Okay? And I'm now going to show you how to get full credit. I'm going to give you what's called a rubric. Hopefully some of you have seen this before. If you haven't, you should demand them of your instructors because they assure fairness in grading. Oh, come on, don't do this. And they also tell you basically exactly what the instructor wants to see. So, down here, you're going to see the area part 1, part 2. Down here is part 3. And then up top, you see these where it says points earned 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. If you do everything in this column of 5 points earned, you will get full credit. So that means you include all 5 requirements. It's got to be at least 2 pages a month, the introduction does, right? And you follow acceptable standards of English and grammar. You're going to get all 5 points for that part of the paper. Part 2 in the observations, as long as you list your observations and you include those notes that we talked about, the questions you ask, or you would pose at least 2 questions if you had watched with others. You do those things and then you write up those findings using the 3 sections, observations on the show, observations of others, and questions. You're dialed. 5 points. Okay, and then part 3 is the theory. You got to use at least 1 theory. Sorry, this came out a little funky when I formatted it. So you're going to use at least 1 theory. You use appropriate concepts for the selected theory. So if you're using symbolic interactionism, you wouldn't want to use double consciousness because that would make no sense. And you explain why you chose the theory that you did. And you give at least 2 examples from your findings, from what you saw. So you're giving 2 examples of how the concepts in the theories apply. 5 points. Then finally the conclusion. As long as you address why or was this an interesting project, would you do it again, the sociological research and your selected major, and you give an explanation for each question, 5 points dialed in 25 points altogether. Now, if you don't do that, you'll notice on top where it says missing a point, every time you miss one of these requirements, you lose a point. So you don't include all 5, and you only do 4, you're going to miss a point. 3, 2, and 1. I'm not going to go here. I'm not doing 4, 3, 2, and 1 because I expect that everybody's going to do number 5. I'm giving it to you right here. No reason not to get an A. And I know what some of you are doing right now. You're overthinking it. We talk about this all the time on the phone and in our office hours. You're overthinking it. Don't overthink it. Have fun with this assignment. That's what it's all about. As I said, parents, if you want to watch, or, aunts, uncles, cousins, babysitters, whatever, you want to watch Sesame Street with a bunch of little kids, let me tell you, that is an hour well spent. I do it often. I love Sesame Street. It's legit. And it tells you an awful lot about the society that we live in. Unfortunately, I didn't get to show you Elmo. Maybe I'll do that later. So there you go. That is posted up. It's due on the 9th by, I think, 11:59. Please get that done. There's also oh no, where did I go? There's also a space for you to post it up. Let me show you that real quick. You'll see that down here. Sorry, I don't mean to make you sick. What? Okay. Now all the way down here, and there you go. Project assignment, and then the project upload. You just simply click on this bad boy, and you can upload your paper. Okay? There you go. Now, when you do this, if you get it into me early enough, and I'm not talking about 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon, but if you get it into me early enough, I will take a look at it. I'll give you some feedback, send it back at you so you can revise it and get full credit on the assignment, if you send it to me before Wednesday of next week. So there you go, guys. I think we're done. Thanks for hanging in there with me so long. You guys have a great night, day, whatever. Take care, and I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.